I want to welcome everybody this evening. Thanks for coming, especially those of you that attended the ARCE annual meeting this weekend and maybe are a little bit saturated with papers and talks, so we're really glad that everybody came. Tonight we're excited to have with us Professor Aidan Dodson. Since earning his PhD from Christ's College in Cambridge, Professor Dodson has taught at both the University of Bristol and the American University in Cairo, where he was a Simpson Professor of Egyptology. And as of last August, he is honorary full professor of Egyptology in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Bristol. And along with his impressive teaching credentials, Professor Dodson is also on the editorial board of Kemet magazine. Those of you who are not subscribers, we urge you to, it's a little shameless plug, we urge you to subscribe to Kemet magazine. Professor Dodson is also the renowned author of more than 20 books. Undoubtedly, some of you have them, including his latest book, Seti I, King of Egypt, His Life and Afterlife, and it's this work that he's going to share with us tonight. So without further ado, Professor Aidan Dodson.
Thank you very much indeed. Nice to be back in New York once again. I'm trying to remember how many years ago I first came to New York, probably too many to really want to admit to. But anyway, wonderful to be back here again and to give a shameless plug, I suppose, for my new book. However, Seti I is one of those kings of Egypt who one is aware of, but probably has never really been given his full due. He's often rather overwhelmed by the presence of his son, Ramses II. But he was probably, as far as we can probably tell from the material which survives, and I'll explain some thinking around that, somebody whose personality, I think, penetrates through the archaeological record rather more than many others. I'm sure everybody really knows their Egyptian country. It's always just worthwhile for anybody who happens to walked in off the street and this is their first introduction to Egypt, just to bear in mind where we're talking about in a 3,000-year period of time which we call ancient Egypt. And Seti fits rather nicely right in the middle of that whole span of time. But it's something I always point out to my students, for Cleopatra VII, the pyramids were older than Cleopatra is for us. So when we're looking at this kind of time depth, it's really quite something. Anyway, in the middle of all that, we find the hero of our talk tonight, which is Seti I. His reign came at a rather crucial point in time. A few decades prior to it, the whole upheaval of the Amarna period, the almost nullification of everything which had previously been there as far as the concept of what being a king was, what Egypt was, and then following on from him and the extinction of the Egyptian royal bloodline under his successor Tutankhamun, we then have a series of army generals coming to power. First of all, shown here, justifying his assumption of power by carrying out the burial of his predecessor. And then another general, Horemheb, shown here, making an offering to Amun on the 10th pylon at Karnak. And then finally, a third army general had come to the throne, neither of the previous two generals having left an effective heir, in the form of Paramisu, presumably an old army colleague of Horemheb. One possibly imagines the two of them as having been recruits together originally and having served all the way through. And then when Horemheb came to the throne, he turned to loyal army colleagues to carry out the major office of state. And Paramisu took on one of those, that of vizier. He was also overseer of prophets of Upper and Lower Egypt as well, overseeing the national cults. So clearly was the most important person in the country after the king. And when Horemheb died without a surviving heir, it was to Paramessu, who then rejigged his name as Ramses, that the throne fell. As for the ancestry of this new royal line, it seems to have come from the northeast delta, and some of the family tree leading onto Ramesses can be reconstructed from this fragmentary stela now in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And this allows us to find that Ramesses was the son of a Seti, who had a brother called Kamwezi and a sister-in-law called Ta-Emwaji. And then from other data we have, then Ramesses is married to Sitray, and they together have Seti I. So the name Seti, as born by the king, is something which he inherited from his grandfather, and possibly from previous members of the family as well. And the incorporation of the name of the god Set is one of those things which points strongly to a northeast delta origin for this family, and also the fact that later on a great resident city, later known as Pyramisi, is established in that very same area, all of which suggesting that we've got here a family from that area. And looking at all the titles these people are holding, they're all soldiers. So we're looking at a provincial army family who suddenly, without, as far as we can see, any kind of trace of early royal blood, becoming the pharaohs of Egypt and founding the 19th dynasty. And one wonders whether it is the fact that, certainly by the time, looking at the relative ages, by the time that Paramessu had become vizier, he already had a son, and possibly even a grandson as well, was one of the reasons why he was chosen by Horemheb, possibly to break this cycle of generations of army man succeeding unrelated army man. Ramesses I has a very, very short reign, and most of the material naming him more monumentally comes from the reign of his son. And Seti seems to have been a very devoted son to his father, and amongst the things produced by him, and something which is very relevant to a lecture here in New York, is the chapel which he erected at Abydos, with some excavation photos, and also at the bottom some of the blocks from it, which are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Sadly, when it was found, the chapel was badly damaged by salts, and a number of the blocks had to be left behind. Also, a couple were in a private collection, appear to have now disappeared, or at least I've not been able to trace where they are today. So this chapel, so one of the most substantive monuments of Ramesses I, done by his son, we have here. And one of the few contemporary monuments of Ramesses I, this stela from Tenhebwa, showing him rather characteristically offering to Set. The very briefness of Ramesses I's reign is indicated by the state of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Only a couple of corridors had been cut by the time he died, and the last of those corridors was hurriedly enlarged into a burial chamber with a sarcophagus installed, of which only the lid had actually been carved. The rest is rough and only decorated in paint. So we have this picture of a very, very short reign, and if Horemheb and Paramessu were indeed contemporaries in the Egyptian army, it's not surprising that Paramessu didn't survive his elder colleague by long. It's always very instructive to look at the titulary of an Egyptian king, because it's very much a set of ways of them stating almost their policy for the future. The Horus name is fairly banal. Many other kings have the strong bull appearing in Thebes and with a few other epithets. But rather more important is the Nebti name, whereby it includes the phrase Wehemeswet, repeater of births. And that term very much means, in our terms, Renaissance. If one looks back to the reign of Amenemhat I of the 12th dynasty, his titulary included Wehemeswet as well, and it's clear that Amenemhat I was clearly regarding himself as being the beginner of a new era. And then later on, a couple of centuries later on, during the reign of Ramses XI, Wehemeswet is the name given to a unique era proclaimed within a king's reign about the restoring of order following the disorder of the reigns of Ramses IX, Ramses X, early Ramses XI. So the very fact that Wehemeswet forms part of Seti's titulary, I think, is quite an important one, and showing a statement of intent that although things had been returned towards normal following the Amarna period by his predecessors, he was keen to make sure that there was really a good new start here as well. And there's also a military element in here, the repelling the 9 bows in the Nebti name, in the Golden Falcon name, strong of troops in all lands. So those sorts of things are there. And even when one looks at the prenomen, Men Ma'at Re is quite an interesting one, in the sense that the Ma'at element comes from the last of the orthodox kings of the 18th dynasty line, Amenhotep III, and also then the Men is from his predecessor, Ramses I's prenomen as well. So I think one can read an awful lot into these kinds of names, and he seems to be very much stating he is really beginning a new era. Unlike the case of the 18th dynasty, where our knowledge of royal in-laws is fairly scanty, during the new 19th dynasty, possibly as a result of its distinctly plebeian origins, royal in-laws appear on monuments, so that the parents-in-law of Seti I, Ruia and Ruiu, and Ruia is a military man once again. Their daughter marries Seti, and as a result of that, in the temple of Ramses II in the Ramesseum later on, these two members of the military class appear on the walls, a wall of the Ramesseum, alongside their much more distinguished descendants. Their daughter, Tui, one of the wives of Seti I, curiously enough, doesn't seem to appear in any monument contemporary with Seti himself. However, after his death, during the reign of her son, she is writ large. We have this colossal statue of her at Ramesseum, and also this relief of her also at the Ramesseum. Another image of her is this usurped statue, originally made for Ti, the wife of Amenhotep III, but then partly reworked, bearing her name, and also on the side, on either side of the rear column, we have this image of a princess and queen, Henut Mireille. Henut Mireille, her identification has been debated. It has been argued that she is actually a daughter of Ramses II, but the context here of her being on the back of the statue of the wife of Seti I would suggest strongly that she is indeed a daughter of Seti and Tui, and but later then married to her brother Ramses II. Some of you will note the rather odd-looking lower part of the figure of Henut Mireille on there, just because this statue came from Rome, and had been restored during probably the 18th century, when the restorer didn't realise what the bottom half of a princess looked like, and therefore this rather fetching sort of mini kilt was added onto this. As when one looks at the various items of material which sort of have been in Rome since ancient times, some very, very amusing restorations. If you're ever in Rome, have a look at the base of the Seti I obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo. Very interesting what they've done there to it. In addition to Tui, however, there is a further later evidence for another potential wife, or certain wife of Seti I. It's in Papyrus Maya A, which is one of the tomb robbery papyri, and in that it mentions a tomb of a king's wife, Bakit Wernel, of King Menma Re. Although the king at the time of the papyrus, Ramses XI, was a Menma Re, during a king's reign you don't call them by their name, they're simply Pharaoh or His Majesty or whatever. So therefore the fact we've got this king's wife Bakit Wernel of King Menma Re, and also looking at parallels, how other wives are mentioned, this would appear to be a second wife of Seti. But once again, without any kind of contemporary attestation, unfortunately. So, therefore, we have this part of the family tree already established there. And in addition to Henut Miray and Ramses II, who is well known as one of their children, there is also a further child, a daughter called Tia, who marries a man called Chia. Rather interesting, given that her grandparents have been Ruya and Raya. Is this something to do with alliteration? Be required to marry somebody at this period? But anyway, she marries Chia, a treasury official, and their tomb is at Saqqara. Presumably, she had married this treasury official long before any royalty was apparently coming into their lives, but nevertheless, their status is made clear by their placement of their tomb directly next to that of Horemheb at Saqqara. Of Ramses II, the only known son of Seti I and Tui, although there may have been others, the only we have fragments of the divine birth scene relating to him, reused at Medinet Harbour, but clearly, once again, from the Ramesseum, like the block showing Raya and Ruyu. And here we've just got the fragmentary elements of it. Anyway, the top left-hand one is the point of conception, where you've got where Ammon, who is taking the form of Seti at the point of conception, with Tui in front of him, and then at the bottom there you've got a part of the birth scene of Tui from that whole sequence. As the sequence of divine birth, which is familiar to people from the Hatshepsut version at Deir el-Bahri and also the Amenhotep III version at Luxor. Some people have argued the fact that there is a need for this divine birth sequence implies something about the legitimacy or questioning of the legitimacy of the line. However, I think that's often been overstated, because the first example we found was that of Hatshepsut, and there is doubt over her legitimacy, of course. It's used to sort of taint other examples. My own feeling is that this sequence was probably present in all royal memorial temples and other temples which were directly linked with the cult of the individual pharaoh. And it's simply the question of the preservation that means we haven't got more examples of this. If you bear in mind how trashed most of the memorial temples are, and odd fragments from like this all survive from the relatively well-preserved Ramesseum. I think that the question about whether there's anything special about there being a divine birth sequence for a given pharaoh, I think is a bit of a red herring. But certainly, even before his accession, Prince Ramesses has a position unparalleled by any previous prince, as far as we can tell. Because down to at least the reign of Akhenaten, royal sons are never shown on temple walls, and the only time they do actually appear anywhere is by virtue of their day job. So we have a couple of princes appearing by virtue of being high priests during the 18th dynasty, but none of them are simply there because they are the eldest son. That's something which certainly has changes under Seti I, and is shown a number of occasions where Ramesses is shown here acting with his father as clearly part of the royal firm, if you like. As far as the non-royal elements of the household of Seti I is concerned, we only have a relatively small number of officials definitely attested during his reign. This may be because the reign was relatively short. Although for many years it was thought the reign might have been as long as 15 years, latest research is implying 8 or 9 years absolutely maximum. And therefore a lot of the officials who served in the early years of Ramesses II presumably had come into office during Seti's reign, and it was only after Seti's death that their memorials started to be produced. One thing which we've got here, which is presumably contemporary, is this scene of Seti making offerings to the deified Amenhotep I and Ahmes Nefertiri from a Deir Medina source. Behind him is one of them, his vizier. Sadly, as is so often the case in these sort of things, the bit where the vizier's name it was supposed to be is broken away. You've got his title and the determinant of his name, but the actual name is missing, which is really annoying. However, we know there are two possibilities here, Nevermoon or Passer. Passer was the later of the viziers who served Seti, and when he produced his tomb during the reign of Ramesses II, he clearly wanted to memorialise the fact he had served under Seti, and therefore we have this scene here of him being rewarded before a figure of Seti who is clearly now deceased, but that Passer clearly has regarded as important that the king who he began his career under is adequately memorialised in his tomb chapel at Thebes. One of the other few people who we know was serving under Seti I, and we've got actually a contemporary reward scene here, is the overseer of the harem, Hor Min from Saqqara. This particular block is now in the Louvre, but there's also a number of other blocks from the same tomb chapel in Cairo as well. One of the things which was part of Seti's repeating of births, his restarting things, was continuing his predecessor's restoration of monuments damaged under Akhenaten, where figures of the Theban triad had been erased, in particular that of the god Amun. So that the restorations of this had begun under Tutankhamun, and this clearly was a big job, and there were still things which were being restored from scratch for the first time under Seti I. On the other hand, though, Seti also undertakes a number of re-restorations, whereby figures of Amun have been recarved with the features of Tutankhamun, and presumably also probably I. They have then been adjusted again to look like Seti. So there is, by this point, there is certainly a concern that although nominally orthodox kings, Tutankhamun and I are now being tainted by their association with Akhenaten, and therefore even their restorations of monuments of Amun is being regarded as being something which needs to be revisited, and a restoration of a restoration has to take place. We have a large number of monuments where Seti has done these kinds of restorations. In most cases, he is much more systematic about it than his predecessors, and that we actually have his names and a formula of restoration put here. And we've got an example here. This is a lintel from Bubastis going back to the middle of the 18th dynasty, which had been badly mutilated during the Amarna period. It was almost largely recarved, but with the name of the original king, Amenhotep II, restored to its location. But then in the middle of the whole thing is two columns of text saying that it's actually Seti who has done this. There are various other examples around, but just as one, at Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, the Spears at Timidoros, originally constructed during the earlier part of the 18th dynasty, had been damaged. This was restored by Seti, who also extended it as well. So parts of the interior are recarved by Seti, some are actually carved from scratch under him here. So we have an example of his extension of the earlier structure. Looking at work from scratch, all the various little light blue dots on this map have traces of Seti I's work, but in the time we have available tonight, I don't think I can go through every single site. But a few little highlights of his constructions. For example, there's this Tatar chapel found in 1950 with figures of the king on the laps of goddesses flanking the god Ptah. And then at Heliopolis, we have virtually nothing on the ground relating to him. It's quite clear a lot of major work was done. This, hopefully, many of you will recognise from the Brooklyn Museum, is the base of a model of the forepart of a temple. And this seems to probably have been a votive, votive builder's plan, if you want to call that, for the additions which were made by Seti to the temple of Re at Heliopolis. So here we've got it at its current as found, and here as restored with a restoration in the Brooklyn Museum with sphinxes, colossi, and obelisks. And one of the obelisks from this, which this model represented, almost certainly that in Piazza del Popolo in Rome, the one which I mentioned earlier on, with a rather interesting bit of Renaissance and restoration at the bottom of it. Also, probably from Heliopolis, are these, or it's the fragment on the left here, fished out of the sea at Alexandria, now on display there, which is the lower part of, which is the bit just below the apex of an obelisk in the name of Seti I, with a rather interesting set-headed Sphinx shown before Re on there, and also an unfinished obelisk in a quarry at Aswan, quartzite one. This is almost certainly originally intended for building work at Heliopolis, which was however never completed. As I mentioned, the reign seems to be relatively short, and inscriptions talking about the mass production of colossal statues aren't paralleled on the ground by such statues with the name of Seti on them. But as Peter Brand has pointed out, that there's a lot of statues which clearly belong to the beginning of Ramses II's reign, which almost certainly were ordered under Seti, and those orders were made in year 8, all of which sort of suggests that he was dead no later than year 10. So 8 or 9 years seems now to be the best bet of a guess as to the length of the reign of Seti. At Abydos, we have what is probably the most famous, or joint most famous, of Seti I's monuments, which is his great temple. Many kings had placed chapels or other kinds of monuments at Abydos over the millennia, but Seti's is one of the most largest and most imposing of such things. It's also rather an unusual thing. In part, its basic layout, I suppose, recalls your standard New Kingdom temple, a couple of pylon-fronted courtyards, and then hypostyle halls, and then an interior. But rather than the 3 sanctuaries you would normally find, you've got no fewer than 7 sanctuaries on there, and also this rather unusual extension off to the left, making the whole thing something of an L shape. And then behind it, the singular monument known as the Osireion, some kind of cenotaph, which we'll be talking about in a moment. But these 7 sanctuaries, which are the major gods of Egypt, plus Sethy himself, very much seems to make his temple at Abydos almost a microcosm of his ambitions as a king. The outermost parts were never completed during his reign, and like so much of Sethy's work, was only completed under Ramses II. And this is also true in the first hypostyle hall, where although the decoration had been sketched out under Sethy, it was completely recarved under Ramses II, in very much typical Ramses II kind of style, which then contrasts massively, even for the less informed, when one moves into the following second hypostyle hall, which is entirely in the exquisite decoration that is typical of the reign of Seti I. And all this decoration also continues on into the inner parts of the temple, the various sanctuaries, the most expansive of which is that of Osiris, which I'm highlighting here. Rather than just simply having a double-roomed sanctuary like all the other deities, his entryway is simply the ante-hall of a much larger complex, and we have here looking through the ante-chapel into the inner part, and then into the main Osiris hall here, all adorned with raised relief of exquisite quality. The temple has other unusual features, one of the most famous of course being the so-called Gallery of the Lists, here with the left-hand wall taken up by the great king list of the temple, with the king and Prince Ramses reading a prayer to various earlier gods. And of course this list was written from the earliest days of Egyptology, an important source of data, and in its omission of the Amarna kings from the end of it, really it further underlines the fact that Seti's reign is a point whereby the revised vision of what had been happening in the previous few years is in place. The Osireion at the back of the temple is without parallels. It is a subterranean complex approached quite interestingly from outside the enclosure, which is at the top right-hand corner of the highlighted area. That's actually the entrance to the Osireion. It's not entered from within the temple complex itself. And although now exposed by archaeology, when originally complete, probably was surmounted by some kind of tumulus, and then the hallway in the middle of it is some kind of island, possibly the primeval mound, and then there are further chambers around it, most of them never finished, but where they were finished, either under Sethy himself or under his grandson, Muremptar, they all indicate the funerary nature of this structure. We've got chunks from the Book of the Gates and the sort of thing you'd find in a Valley of the Kings tomb. But so at the centre of it, though, this primeval mound surrounded by water. I've never actually been there at the right time of year for this, but a friend of mine was here exactly the point in time where the island is dry with the water around it, and you've got depressions for a dummy sarcophagus, a dummy canopic chest. So it's clearly a dummy tomb, but understanding the meaning of the Osireion is difficult simply through the lack of any obvious parallels from earlier or later periods. So again, probably is something of the innovative spirit which is engendered by Seti I himself. Relatively little in the way of three-dimensional sculpture survived from Seti's reign. So part of it may be because much of it was being manufactured at the time of his death and therefore didn't actually receive his cartouches. Some of the best preserved are a number which were found at Abydos, including one which should be quite familiar to everybody here, I think, because it's only just down the road in the Met. The next major area of surviving material from Seti's reign comes, of course, from the Theban area. And on the east bank, we have, in the temple complex of Karnak, perhaps the greatest of Seti's constructional efforts, which is the great hypostyle hall. The space occupied by the hypostyle hall was defined by the third pylon of Amenhotep III and the second pylon of Horemheb. What, if anything, was in between the two remains a matter of debate. There are some who argue that there are Aten period elements which were in place there, but at the moment one can't be absolutely certain of that. What one can be certain of, however, is that the construction of the hypostyle hall appears to be entirely the work of Seti, rather than begun by an earlier king, as has been suggested. On this, I'm very much leaning on Peter Brand's work on the area. So there we have on the left the third pylon, the hypostyle hall as created by him there. Although the whole hall seems to have been constructed by Seti, only the northern part was decorated during his reign. The rest of it was left undecorated, or at least decorated only in sort of initial cartoons, leaving a lot of it to be decorated by Ramses II, with large amounts then added on by later Ramesside kings. So really, say it's only in the northern part that we find representations of Seti, which stylistically, again, stand out massively from that of later kings, and also show a number of interesting features. The pose of the king is relatively unusual, and he's normally shown with a slight deferential bend towards gods rather than standing direct upright before them. And also it seems it may have taken a while for them to get the style right, because when we look at the figure on the left there, one sees that there are multiple buttocks. It looks like that the figure has been recut on a number of different occasions, and it's also true of a number of other of the images of the king on this wall, but gets less so as one moves further along the wall, suggesting that there is very much some experimentation going on as to exactly how the king wants to be seen in these. That there seems to be a level of scrutiny or a level of detail which you don't really see so much with other kings. And also the fact the whole thing is done in a very, very high quality raised relief, which probably also accounts for the slow progress as compared with the sunk relief often used by later kings. In addition to the inner walls, which are all to do with offerings to the god, the outer walls are used to set out the king's military activities. And already mentioned in his Titular, there are specific military allusions, and coming from a family of soldiers, and it's possible he himself was an army officer before his accession, it's not surprising we have quite extensive set of military activities carried out. The earliest military activities under the king seem to be in southern Palestine, probably more akin to police actions than anything else. They are recorded on the eastern section of these external walls of the hypostyle hall, and the information from that is reinforced by a couple of stelae which were found at Beth Shan and now in Jerusalem. So this of a year 1 stela of Seti I fits in rather well alongside the data which can be derived from the scenes on the eastern part of the North Wall. However, as the reign went on, it's clear that rather more extensive and more ambitious things went on. Up in North Syria, there had been clashes with the Hittites since at least the time of Tutankhamun, and also probably the result of the whole Zananza affair had clearly poisoned relationships between the Egyptians and the Hittites. We say we have some evidence of stuff going on under Horemheb, but under Seti there seems to be an attempt really to try and sort things out, and extensive campaigning takes place up in this area as well. These northern campaigns are a major part of the decoration of the western end of the North Wall, and here we've got the lower register here is explicitly a Hittite campaign. Unfortunately, unlike the Palestinian campaigns, we have no specific dates of these. Part of the problem being on the right-hand edge of the slide here, where Shoshenq I hit the outer wall of his courtyard at Karnak up against the end part of the where these registers turn round the corner. So the bit at the beginning where you'd normally have year X and mark, so is now behind sandstone, rather annoyingly. So anyway, you have that. What you've got here, each of them, although they are slightly different, has the same basic theme. You start off with the king, which is what would have been round the corner, the king advancing towards the area of operations, fighting the battle on the right there, then taking prisoners back to Egypt, and finally on the left-hand end you find him presenting the prisoners to the Theban triad, sometimes with additional deities thrown in as well. So you've got this register, which is the Hittite campaign. Then we have a Libyan campaign, which which we have not attested elsewhere. Presumably, if one assumes that these registers are in order, they're first of all is work to secure Egypt's position in the Levant, and then further work to secure a position to the west. And then the final set of the final register at the top there deals with a campaign to Kadesh. Kadesh seems to have been the linchpin of controlling northern Syria, going back to the time at least of Thutmose III when he campaigned up here, and of course a few years later would be the site of Seti's son's great alleged victory. Although for anyone who knows how the British sort of talk about soccer results, a score draw, whereby both sides have scored the same number of goals and normally are not particularly happy about it. That seems to be what Ramses' Battle of Kadesh was. Seti claims to have been rather more successful in this, but the detail of what's going on is made rather difficult by the fact that most of this register is missing. We're just lucky that there's enough surviving from the right-hand end to make it clear it is Kadesh, which is the object of the operations, so the rest of it, unfortunately, is gone. As far as sculpture is concerned at Karnak, again, not a huge amount of Seti's stuff survives, again, because we were saying there's likelihood that a lot of his intended material was ultimately finished by his son. But we have this rather fine composite statue being a style really very much more popular in the Amarna period. And then also this piece of wonderful three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle work carried out by Hurri Sarusian a few years ago in the Cairo Museum, with bits and pieces from found in all over Karnak, reunited in this group, with the king shown very, very small there, being protected by Ammon and Mut, a motif which certainly goes back to the immediate post-Amarna period, where we've got a number of examples of Tutankhamun in exactly that kind of position. Other monuments in the south of Egypt, out in the eastern desert at Khanais or Wadi Abad, we have this small rock-cut temple with rock-cut stelae, which were part of a settlement for the use of mine workers in the East Desert, and the building of this settlement in year 8 is one of the last dated events of the king's reign. A well was built here, is the main thing, then you've got a settlement and a temple to support that. And this is a view inside the Khanais Wadi Abad temple, constructed by Seti I, and still with some rather well-preserved paintings in it. At Jebel Silsila, we have the first of a series of shrines to the Nile. Ramses II and Merenptah also produced them. Seti is the one on the far left there, largely unfortunately taken up by the inundation, by the Nile, has swallowed it up. But here again, is kicking off a concept which is carried on by his successors here. At Komombo, very recently, work by the SCA, Ministry of Antiquities, has now revealed a stela of Seti at a site which previously had been largely Greco-Roman as far as survived material. A lot of New Kingdom stuff is now coming out of the ground, including this stela of Seti I. I apologise for the quality of this reconstruction. This is from various press photographs of the bits in place and so on. But what this does show is that you've got Seti worshipping both Horus and Sobek, showing that the dual nature of the gods worshipped at Komombo goes back this far. The text, unfortunately, all the sort of press photos are too low resolution to be able to read, but they seem to mention the name of Horemheb. So it looks as though Seti is carrying on some work of Horemheb, restoring something of Horemheb, something or other, but hopefully this will be published reasonably soon so we can get an idea of what's going on here. But clearly it indicates that Komombo, not previously regarded as somewhere Seti had been active, was a place where things were happening. Also, like most New Kingdom pharaohs, we have material in Nubia, at Khazar-Ibrim, now moved to New Kalabsha, this memorial to some kind of Nubian, probably police action. Also deep in Nubia, the Nauri decree, a decree to do with the resources allocated to his temple at Abydos, hundreds of miles further to the north. And find that Jebel Barkal, the heart of the religious capital of Egyptian Nubia, room B503 in the Great Temple of Ammon at Jebel Barkal seems to be the work of Seti. Going back to Thebes, however, we start looking at the last monuments of Seti's career, those of his funerary domain. At Qurna, we have his memorial temple. Interestingly placed with regards to the other ones, it's much further east and much more explicitly aligned up with Karnak. So probably an idea to link his work with the hypostyle hall there with his memorial temple. As at Abydos, the outer pylons are now destroyed, but the inner part is in a tolerable state, certainly a better state than most memorial temples of previous eras. And once again, however, much of the decoration was the work of Ramses II. For a long time, the presence of Ramses II decoration in Seti's monuments was regarded as being some kind of indication of a co-regency or prince regency or something like that. but it's now clear that that isn't the case, that where you do have representation of Seti I alongside in elements carved by his son, these are simply emphasising that it's Seti's original building rather than any indication of the two being alongside each other. The temple is a rather typical one of the New Kingdom, memorial temple-wise, with a central axis dedicated to the god Ammon, and here we've got what survives of that. There is also a sun court to the north, again something which is a typical feature of New Kingdom memorial temples. This part only ever decorated under Ramses II in probably some of the most execrable style I've ever seen in a Theban memorial temple. Again, the contrast between this, probably done quite late on in Ramses' reign, and the original stuff done under Seti is quite striking. And then we have the royal mortuary complex at the southern end. What's interesting here is that although earlier examples, particularly that of Hatshepsut, linked the king and his father in the royal mortuary complex here it's Ramses I's complex which is the most prominent. It's the one which you actually see is entered directly from the facade of the temple. Seti's own one is stuck is rather hidden round the back. Part of this may be because Ramses I did not complete a memorial temple during his own reign. Also, however, Philip Martinez's examination of the temple suggested that Seti actually took over the foundations from an earlier king, most probably his father. So therefore, as part of that, probably a degree of guilt would have emphasised giving Ramses the most prominent location of the memorial chapels. So Seti's is actually behind that of Ramses. And unfortunately, which is just up here, although Ramses' chapel is in perfect state, that of Seti, that is almost entirely lost. The forecourt of it is still in place, the forehall is in place, but all the area of just you've got one layer of blocks is actually the memorial chapel of Seti himself. Linked, of course, to the memorial temple, of course, is the tomb itself, which is often regarded as sort of the most famous of Seti's monuments, IV-17, his great tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It's the longest tomb in the valley, as we can see here, stretching across almost from the central area of the valley all the way to underneath the tomb of Thutmose III at the far end of it. That length, however, is rather unusually set out. Half of it is a conventional tomb, a tomb of a form which really very similar to the Horem Heb, which itself was a straightened version of the typical royal tomb of the middle of the 18th dynasty. However, in addition, underneath what is the conventional burial hall, this long tunnel, elements K1 to K10, descends deeply into the rock, a feature which is without parallel in any other royal tomb, and was finally cleared out by Zahiawas a few years ago to show its true depth. Exactly what it means is somewhat unclear, but a suggestion made a long time ago by John Romer was that it may have been heading towards the water table, and that the intention had been to place some kind of burial room, possibly even with the kind of island on it that we see at the Osireion here. And what might support that idea is the fact that the king didn't have a great stone sarcophagus, instead he had a much more compact stone anthropoid coffin, which would certainly have fitted all the way down there. However, like so many of the rest of Seti's monuments, it was never completed, and so therefore we don't know what the intent was. All we know is that the coffin was left at the entrance to that they covered over entrance to this long thing. So the plan of the tomb is very, very similar to earlier ones. However, it's innovative once again in that it's decorated through the entire length of the tomb. Previously, royal tombs were decorated in the burial chamber, antechamber, and possibly a couple of earlier rooms. In this case, the tomb is decorated from the very entrance with a selection of books of the underworld which has not previously been used in this kind of way. So here we can see there on this drawing of the tomb, actually done by Giovanni Belzoni back in 1818, showing the layout of the decoration, which allegedly was in perfect condition when the tomb was discovered. Unfortunately, very badly deteriorated over the years, but still one of the most beautifully decorated tombs in the valley. The entrance lintel beginning something which culminates in the great vaulted burial chamber, the first royal tomb with an astronomical ceiling, and say a very different kind of layout of the books of the underworld from what would have been typical in earlier times. And already mentioned, rather than a great stone, a granite or quartzite sarcophagus, there was simply an alabaster, calcite, travertine, Egyptian alabaster, whatever you want to call the stuff, anthropoid coffin bearing the Book of the Gates. The trough is in pretty well perfect condition, now into John Soane's Museum in London. The lid smashed by robbers, and that is a reconstruction of what it looked like. And once again, so decorated by the Book of the Gates. Fragment of the canopic chest was found in the tomb. Just this corner is all that survives. And this is Horemheb's restored example, just as to give a feel for what the whole thing looked like. Also, huge numbers of Shabti figures were found in the tomb, of a number of different sorts. A few of these great, always presentation ones in blue faience, a lot of smaller blue faience ones, and then wooden ones, and a few in alabaster as well. What is curious is that very little else was found in the tomb when opened in 1818. We know that most other royal tombs had large numbers of wooden figures and so on. None of these are reported by Belzoni, who is fairly thorough in reporting what he's found. The only other thing he talks about is a mummified bull, probably more likely to be mummified for meat rather than a sacred animal, as Belzoni argued. So it's one of the little mysteries around what happened to the rest of the funerary equipment. As for the mummy, however, we know all too well what happened to it. It lay undisturbed in the valley for only a relatively short period of time, and we can actually trace a fair chunk of what happened to it subsequently by the dockets which were placed on the restored coffin, showing that during the 21st dynasty and into the early 22nd dynasty, it was moved more than once, finally coming to rest sometime in the reign of Shoshenq I in the so-called tomb 320, the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, which we can see here, and where the king then rested undisturbed until around 1871, when he was discovered by the Abdel-Rasul brothers, and in 1881 Emile Brugsch supervised the removal of the body to Cairo, where it was unwrapped in 1886, revealing what is often been regarded as being the best looking mummy. But as you can see, the rest of the body is fairly badly battered around by robbers. And to date, he rests in Tahrir Square, although I'm aware there is plans for him and the other royal mummies to ultimately move to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Fustat. But for the time being, he rests in Tahrir, and so without wishing to be too much of a sort of trying to sell one's product, the much fuller version of tonight's lecture is available in this book, which should be on sale properly at early next month, I understand. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Why is it that why before the time of Seti were princes not shown as princes?
The question there was, why before Seti's time were princes not shown as princes? No idea is the answer. Like so many things in ancient Egypt, all we can say is they weren't, because they're simply not there where you'd expect. A very good example is at the Temple of Soleb, where during his jubilee, Amenhotep III is shown with his wife and daughters. We know he had two sons, future Akhenaten and Prince Thutmose. They're not there. And there's other examples going right back to the Old Kingdom. The only times the royal sons appear is when they've got a day job, they're a high priest or something like that. One would love to know why that decorum existed, but say, like so much stuff in ancient Egypt, we know what happened, but why, they didn't bother to tell us, sadly. Yes, sir?
With the proposed shorter reign, what dates do you assign?
There is a very good question. What dates would one assign to Seti?
Start up, or do you move then back?
The thing is, the chronology I espouse is a rather lower chronology than most people would do so. I prefer to take, there's a high, middle and low, and there's also a couple of ultra low, and I'm one of the more ultra lowers. On that basis, I would probably put him between about 1275 to 1265, which I know is a fairly shockingly late, but it fits in with a broader chronology. That's a sort of time I would put him at. Though I have to say that reducing him to that does cause problems with conventional chronology as well. You would be aware there is now a major fight going on over the length of the reign of Horemheb, for example. And the problem is that a lot of these sort of things you're going on with looking at refining reign length is making them shorter. So a lot of the conventional chronologies require the maximum, and because I think most of the conventional ones have sort of assumed Seti with a 15-year reign. When you drop him down to 8, possibly Horemheb down to 14, it all gets rather problematic. You're really going to start from scratch again. But that's a whole other lecture, which my students get 2 hours of. And you probably don't want to sit here for another 2 hours while I sort of dig out the file and give you that one. But I would put him somewhere around 1275 to 1265. 1265 is where I'm currently preferring to place the accession of Ramses II. Yes, sir.
Do we have any sense of his age when he acceded to the throne?
The problem with his body, of course. The trouble is that there are issues with ageing mummies, or actually ageing bodies which are more than a couple of hundred years old. Because although the anthropologists have got their schemes, about 20 years ago, a case study came up in Britain. They cleared the vault of a church in London of bodies from the 18th and 19th centuries, AD. And all of these bodies, most of them had nice little funerary plates on them saying, this here lies so-and-so with their age and death and everything. But they decided to send the bodies off to the physical anthropologists for blind tasting. And the physical anthropologists got them all massively wrong. Well, not all of them, at least a third of them were decades out. So if there's problems with looking at things which are only, which are based on European, assume it that I think the current thought is Seti is probably 40s or 50s. I think it's what in the Scanning the Pharaohs book I think they came up with, which if you then sort of work back to when he was, let's say we came to the throne 10 years before that, etc., etc. But I'm always very, very nervous about these things because, say, there's this And I'm not really sure how far the physical anthropologists, apart from just sort of having a nervous breakdown, have actually done with the Spitalfields material. And also I'm not sure how far Egyptological physical anthropologists are aware of this particular data. But it was really quite shocking that that there were people who we knew were in their 90s when they died were being assessed as 40-somethings on their skeletons. And so I'm very, very nervous about even mentioning the actual physical ages of these people. Yes, sir?
Spelling, which is your own, I don't think it appears anywhere else other than Seti I.
No, there are, but basically what I've tried to do there is, because the actual hieroglyphic set is actually, there are examples where it's actually written with S, T, and the H with the, whatever the proper name for that is, anyway. So actually there is an H in the hieroglyphic spelling, even though we generally don't use it, and it's also a double yod at the end of the name. So what I try and do when I'm using it with these the spellings is to try and get the hieroglyphic structure in the Romanised version of it, even if it's not necessarily pronounced that way. So that's the reason I've used it that way around. And I had a long discussion on Facebook with somebody on this about why I used that one. And I think it's the most correct of the ones. Certainly an I on the end isn't right because it's double yod quite clearly in the hieroglyphs. So, but this is really for nerds and geeks. So discussion.
Any hints as to what your next book is going to be?
A book on Ramses III is in the press. Gary?
Yeah, is there any significance that you could see in the fact that Amun names seem to disappear in the 19th dynasty on, and we see a different line of names, and also the use of Seti as a name?
Yeah, I think what you're finding, is in the whole post-Amarna period, there's almost a rethinking of almost everything. Nothing goes quite back to normal after Amarna. The direct decoration of private tomb chapels, all sorts of things. And I think, in some ways, the post-Amarna sort of frees up the idea there are more gods out there to play with. But also, when you've got a royal family who are clearly from a provincial line, it's sort of, I think everything is freed up somewhat, so people are more relaxed about their not necessarily wanting to be sort of part of this whole Ammon. And although sort of the execration of Ammon is reversed, I suspect the very fact that the god had been sort of laid low under Akhenaten probably meant that he was never quite the same omnipresent deity as people possibly used to think. So I think the post-Amarna world is. There's a lot of people say, well, it just all went back to normal. In fact, it didn't. Almost every little thing you scratch, comparing pre-Amarna to post-Amarna, things have moved on. Even something like a coffin decoration. Pre-Amarna, you have a vulture across the chest. After Amarna, you have the goddess Nut. Everything changes. So I think that's probably where what's happening with the names. That suddenly the world has moved on. Yes, sir.
I noticed that Abydos in his tomb, in his cartoon, Set is not used as the figure of Osiris in the Isis line. Presumably, Set was the enemy of Osiris, so in the realm of Osiris, you don't want to offend him with Set.
Very definitely.
I noticed in the tomb of Set I believe that it does use the Set animal. Are there any other examples of this? There aren't that many. Setis, of course, but are there any other examples of any? Seti II, or
I think so. I think Seti II also goes down the Osiris route, but I wouldn't want to swear to it. You'd have to actually look at the picture to do so. But I think probably ties in with Seti being, he seems to be a very aware person about things. And also with all this stuff about him just sort of trying to muck around with the angle of his back on sort of in front of the gods and things. I think he's much more sort of he's thought about this kind of stuff, and that probably comes out of that. But also you do actually find that Ammon is sometimes substituted for Set as well in some of these other contexts. And I think it all sort of is an indication of the very difficult. Set is a difficult character. He's a god, yet he's a murderer. Yet but also I think you also regard him as sort of being the god's muscle man in a way, because he's the one who kills Apophis. He's a necessary thug in the family who is sort of, if he can be kept under control, he's okay. In certain contexts, he's okay. It's almost, you've actually got somebody who is okay unless they take some crack. It's sort of he would be a very interesting sort of character to if you look at modern social services would deal with him as a member of the family. He's got qualities which are necessary, but not other ones. And so I think the degree to which that's sort of dealt with depends on the king. And I think that probably Seti, he was thinking quite, and particularly with building this huge temple at Abydos, he was probably particularly nervous about what you did with Set in that context.
We have a reception, a small reception to follow. So with that,